If you remember trading all your belongings for a shiny blue eyes, dueling your friends during lunch break, and watching Seto Kaiba get threatened by finger guns, then you were there when Yu-Gi-Oh! Ruled the world. And in this video we're going to take a trip down memory lane to that special time in the early 2000s that saw the first wave of Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, trading cards, and video games reach the West. But first, let's set the scene. The story of Yu-Gi-Oh! Begins with its creator, Kazuo Takahashi. By the mid-90s, Takahashi had spent over a decade trying to become a successful manga artist and had spent most of that time living in poverty. But by 1996, Takahashi's fortunes would change with the release of Yu-Gi-Oh! In the weekly Shonen Jump. However, this was far from the story of friendship and the heart of the cards that we come to know in the West. The early chapters of the manga were pretty dark and outright violent. Plus, this was never conceived as a vehicle for a successful card game. The story does follow Yugi, a short boy with crazy hair who, after solving the Millennium Puzzle, becomes possessed by an ancient spirit. However, instead of having noble intentions and a silky smooth voice,
I know marijuana is harmful. I know it can't improve my game.
This version of the spirit is a gambling addict without a nose who spends every chapter playing a new shadow game with the dregs of society and punishing them in horrific ways. For example, we've got the one with the escaped convict who holds Taya hostage and ends up setting himself on fire. Or how about the hipster who steals Joey's Air Jordans and then ends up being bitten by a poisonous scorpion. In fact, the Duel Monsters card game won't make an appearance until chapter 9 with the introduction of Kaiba, who was supposed to be just another villain of the week who gets sent into the Shadow Realm and tortured by his own monsters after losing. The card game itself was originally simply one of the many games played by Yugi against his adversaries. However, the reader's feedback to Duel Monsters was so overwhelming that eventually Takahashi reworked the entire manga to focus on the card game. In 1998, the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime would be released in Japan, known in the fandom as Season 0. This anime would present an abridged version of the early manga chapters but would maintain its dark tone and emphasis on different types of games. And Kaiba had green hair. However, by this point the manga was already focused on the card game. Plus, in 99, Konami would launch the trading card game in Japan, and the last thing they wanted was for impressionable young players to come home after dueling their friends in school and see the card game's mascot setting a man on fire. And so the dark, violent version of the anime would be scrapped after 27 episodes to make way for Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, a lighter reboot with a heavy focus on the card game. Meanwhile, in the West, we were all deep in the throes of Pokemon fever. The franchise's four pillars of anime, card games, merchandise, and video games made it a money-making juggernaut. Naturally, Western licensees were eager to import more Japanese properties in hopes of replicating Pokemon's success, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Was a prime candidate. In late September of 2001, 4Kids would begin airing the anime as a way to build up hype for the trading card game, which would be released in March of the following year. And I've got to hand it to the Japanese, they really knew how to sell a kids product. These aren't just cardboard trading cards, these are magical artifacts bestowed with the power of ancient monsters and gods wielded by the spirit of an Egyptian pharaoh. In this world, corporations and nations don't settle their conflict with armed forces and weapons, they do it via the trading cards. In fact, the fate of the entire world is decided by these trading cards, and you can pick them up at your local Woolworths for just £2.50 per booster pack. Now, the Duel Monsters anime, which was simply known as Yu-Gi-Oh! In the West, would run for 5 seasons. But that first season was the one to really set the hype flames ablaze. The season follows Yugi and his friends as they compete in the Duelist Kingdom tournament set on a remote island. Now, I loved watching this season after school on Sky 1 as a kid, but even back then I had some questions. For example, why would Kaiba, a millionaire CEO, go to a state-funded school? Also, why does Kaiba sound like evil Brock from Pokemon?
Could they have found the card that I've been searching for?
And why does Yugi's grandpa almost die after losing a card game? Look, they have the ambulance pick him up and everything. Poor grandpa, he barely recovers from his trading card-induced stroke, and in the very next episode he's trapped inside a television. I wonder which one of these is the main character. Is anyone going to acknowledge the fact that Yugi's voice drops and he grows 1.5 feet every time it's time to play cards? Plus, his feet shrink 3 shoe sizes? Now, the first season is notorious for being very loose loose with the card game rules. You know, like characters summoning high-ranking monsters with no tribute or sacrifice whatsoever, plus many more made-up rules. CVIT did a great video on this, so check that out if you want to learn more. In order to spice things up visually, the first season also had a bunch of these environmental battles where the characters just made up rules as they went along. Remember that time Yugi summoned a moon and then destroyed it? See, this is how you know Pegasus is a bad guy. Look at him laughing maniacally while eating cheese and drinking wine while sitting behind the world's longest table.
Gorgonzola cheese and the world's finest fruit juice.
Oh, I'm sorry, he's drinking fruit juice. That's right, the 4Kids version of Yu-Gi-Oh! Has become notorious for its censorship. From the various examples of finger guns to the lasers on the barrel dragon to the conservatively dressed harpy ladies. Also, the cards have been simplified from their Japanese version. The darker elements from the original do show up occasionally even in this heavily censored 4Kids version. Like this one episode where Joey gets chased by death, and this episode where Panic tries to burn Yugi alive. But even with all these quirks, this was still a staple of after-school anime for those of us growing up in the early 2000s. In the later seasons, the show would stick a bit closer to the card game rules while continuing to introduce many fan-favorite moments like the Battle City tournament, which quite frankly deserves its own video, but to me, nothing would quite match the heights and excitement of that first season. Of course, the whole point of the anime was to promote the real-world trading card game, which was launched across North America and Europe in 2002. And the cards from those first few boosters and starter decks will forever be ingrained in our minds. And I'm not just talking about the biggies, I'm all about the unsung legends like Beaver Warrior, Battle Ox, Dion Keto the Lunch Lady, Mystical Elf, Lejin, Tiger Turtle, Catapult Turtle, UFO Turtle. I wonder if they were all friends. I really do love some of this early artwork. For example, here we have Hashinogen who smoked enough to hotbox a mansion. And how about Nimble Momonga, aka Flying Roadkill? And speaking of flying, why does a bird need goggles and a jetpack? And look, he clearly looks fed up with being asked that question. And of course we have the spell and trap cards that everybody would spam. In these early days, the rules weren't that well defined yet. And what I mean by that is most of us didn't have the internet to fact check our friends' bullshit rules. The starter decks came with these little rule books, but if you didn't carry one of those around, it was pretty much a free-for-all. We all knew that one kid with 20 Ragikis in his deck, or the one who just straight up tried to summon Blue Eyes with absolutely no tributes in the very first turn. I guess the anime really didn't help in that regard. Back then, it was all about the beatdown style of play. You can miss me with your nuanced strategy, modern players. At 11 years old, my sole purpose in life was to drain my opponent's life points as soon as possible. The trading card game seemingly became a success overnight. By late 2002, every playground bench, classroom desk, and kitchen table would play host to a Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel. Of course, you had all sorts of players, from the lowly peasants who'd wrap a rubber band around their deck to the upper classes with their fancy covers and deck boxes. The same went for the kids who'd use the official field fold-out versus those of us who just tried to play our cards around the bird poo. Then you had the kids who thought they were big time and wagered their best card against yours only to throw a temper tantrum and run away when they lost. You also had the people with the fake Chinese cards and that one kid whose grandmother would buy him 20 boosters a week. Now that was the one you wanted to be friends with. Dueling aside, the trading cards themselves quickly became a form of currency. DVDs, games, homework, all could be traded for the right card. One boy in my school tried to trade his dad's Jabba Bluetooth earpiece for Obelisk the Tormentor. Naturally, many schools began to ban Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards in an attempt to shut down this black market currency, but all that did was turn the trading card into a form of underground sport. Now, the trading card game and anime were undoubtedly the two pillars responsible for Yu-Gi-Oh's meteoric rise. However, I think it's only fair that I also mention the video games. Just like many Japanese franchises, most of the early games were never released in the West. The first game that would end up getting localized was Forbidden Memories for the PlayStation 1. And even though it was released in North America and Europe in 2002, the original Japanese version was actually released all the way back in 1999, which resulted in this game having a slightly different rule set from the TCG, like summoning high-level monsters without any tributes. But by 2003, the localization drought was over and it seemed like a new Yu-Gi-Oh! Game was released every week. However, many of the games coming out around this time either didn't follow the TCG rules or relied on some new gimmick, which I was never really into, probably because I was too stupid to learn all these new rules. This is why Worldwide Edition always stood out to me. It's the trading card game on the Game Boy set in Battle City. What else do you need? Plus, you could enter codes from the real world cards to build an awesome deck. I remember my pockets were always filled with pieces of paper with my friends' card numbers scribbled on them. What can I say? It was a simpler time. And so there you have it, a look back at a time when Yu-Gi-Oh! Ruled the world. Now the franchise has continued past the early 2000s. The anime would see a whole host of spin-offs which are still going to this day. Same with the video games. The trading card game still has a strong community amongst both the casual and competitive players, although good luck trying to understand all the new mechanics if you haven't played it in 20 years. Unfortunately, Kazuki Takahashi would pass away in 2022, but he left behind a tremendous legacy. His creation grew beyond being just another trading card game. It became a touchstone for an entire generation, and it all started in the late 90s and early 2000s, back when Yu-Gi-Oh! Ruled the world. I hope you enjoy this short trip down memory lane. Please let me know if you'd like to see more videos in this series, and in the meantime leave a comment below with your memories of Yu-Gi-Oh! As always, thanks for watching. Please consider supporting me on Patreon, and a big thanks to all my existing patrons. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.